Tanzanu Tetemtek, Kinu Isqueo Nitsigasan. This is Kathy Richardson, and my Cree name is Kinu Isqueo. And right now I'm on the unceded Abenaki territory in what's called Southern Quebec today. And I am here with a very special person, Jad Orphe Chami, and he's going to have a conversation with me about his really interesting research at Concordia University and whatever other locations this conversation takes us in this beautiful and crazy planet. So, Jad, welcome. And just do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your project and what led you to be not even interested, but just to light up with creativity to do something so profound and moving in a world of superficialities.
Thank you, Kathy. So my name is Jad Orphe Chami. I use he, him. I was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, to wonderful activist, artist parents who were pacifist during the Civil War, and this was immensely implemented in my education, my upbringing, especially because my neighborhood was the place where the war began.
Wow.
So this followed me also in my artistic practice. I studied classical piano, but grew to be interested in theater and especially documentary theater. And when we immigrated to Canada, to Montreal, Jojage in 2015, both my mother, Zena, and I discovered oral history as a practice and begun working with oral history, in her case, in the context of transracial intercultural adoption, and in my case, exploring the role of music, but then also embodied performance practices in the context of testimony-based performances.
Mhm.
Uh, so so alongside my practice as a composer, mainly for film and for dance, I am currently a PhD student at UQAM, and I am supervised by Guy Cools and Eric Letourneau, so respectively a dance professor, dramaturg, and new media visual arts professor and practitioner.
Mhm.
And where I am currently in my project is that I am gradually moving, um, I guess, away from music as the only vector of accompanying testimonies on stage, um, and also perhaps moving a bit away from this idea of having archives being performed. And during my master's, it was the testimonies of the families that disappeared in Lebanon. So moving or perhaps I'm moving away, but at least centering this more towards my own narrative, my own memory, which I call fragmented, because living in Lebanon, I was not exposed to war and to violence the same way as, for example, some other friends who had more of a uh, more of an early reception of the history of the Civil War. So a lot of my memory is fragmented, and a lot of the things that I have lived, including the 2006 war, I had lived it as a vacation, like going to the north and being near the sea. And it comes also to this idea that there is no reconciliation uh, if there is no uh, consensus on what happened. And the history of the civil war in Lebanon is only oral because it is not written down in history books. Therefore, there is a process of grief that has not been uh, initiated. And when I say grief, we're talking, I think, not only about the civil war, but centuries of grief, because Lebanon is a territory that has been occupied for centuries, and the most recent occupation before the French Mandate was a very long Ottoman occupation, which also led to a mass starvation in Mount Lebanon. And in my own family has histories of displacement and also histories uh, of mass killing in the south, which we learned recently. And it seems that a lot of the families in Lebanon have experienced, in a way or so, um, a big unresolved grief that is not permitting us to remember correctly. So the idea of lamentation arrives at a point where I think using terms such as music and dance and theater when thinking about oral history was not getting me where I wanted. And the idea of lamentation is to put grief in action.
Okay.
It's the idea of taking grief and through ancestral practices, but also through new and secular practices of grief performance. My hypothesis, perhaps, is that maybe using this as a vector in oral history could be a way to undig or to unravel memories and testimonies who were silenced and who perhaps do not fit in the framework of a classical oral history interview, where the narrator is being asked, even implicitly, to create a clear arc narrative of their experience. Whereas lamentation is still a testimony, but it is more. I use the word dirty. It is something that is not necessarily beautiful to the ear. It is not necessarily something that is also that follows a clear arc of beginning to end that is not necessarily put into context, but is an expression of of heightened emotions, anger, sadness, and that is expressed naturally through embodied practices, through voice, through wailing. Wailing is something that we share a lot in different cultures. Corsica has wailing, Lebanon has wailing as a practice of lamentation.
Yeah.
And in some other practices, the body is involved. The Shia of Lebanon have a practice where men literally like hit themselves while repeating the word of the martyrs. So I think it also arrives at a point where having a secular upbringing perhaps made me wary of digging into those ancestral practices. But it seemed that today, even if um, I did not grow up with these approaches to grief, I seek to reach back to them or to go back to them because there's something there that is worth not letting go,
Mhm.
uh, and something that is worth exploring and understanding um, in order to highlight the importance of these lamentations and our contemporary unresolved uh, grief in Lebanon.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you've shared a lot there, and I'll just try to pick up some of the themes because what really drew me to your work relates to the fact that I'm involved in what's called response-based practice. And this work is really dedicated to helping people recover from violence, but in a spirit of dignity and social justice and honoring what the person's been through and how they've resisted all along the violence upon them. And really turning to different kinds of language and discourses, like languages of the heart. And we are in an era of what we call I guess, trauma-informed practice and PTSD and all that stuff. And we just push that aside because neuropsych is just like one really thin line of knowledge on this planet. But like you used the word embodied a few times, when you really look at what's happening to people and how they're suffering, most often it's suffering from violence and feeling a state of grief and loss. And I think that it's such a more holistic and even beautiful, if you can say that, a rich way of understanding human experience. And I think, when I heard you talking about words such as rhapsody, it made me think of poetry and older forms such as troubadours,
Mm.
like people that would go from town to town, singing about really important life events. And when you talked about lamentation and how it's not always easy to take in, I thought of the words, resonance that doesn't, resonate with comfort, in a way, like holding up um, the truth to people that doesn't resonate with comfort as well. So I think that those are resonances that I had with your work, and it sounds so very respectful and dignifying, to the people who've been lost and their ancestors and family members. So do, do you can you find a kinship with some of the ideas that I'm sharing here?
No, absolutely. Well, the idea of Rhapsody was already present in my work, but
Mhm.
it was not present for perhaps the reasons that I wished they were at the beginning. Rhapsody in music is at least in the beginning of especially in the Romantic era. It's a piece of music where a composer, so at that time it was a lot of there were a lot of like Russian, Polish composers who would go to villages and collect the melodies that the villagers would play.
Mm.
And this act of collecting, we're also brought back to this idea um of oral history as something that comes from the history of from below. So there's this idea of collecting the melodies that were not present in the on the symphonic stage, but then composing with them and transforming them into a heightened piece for an audience in the big cities. So it was quite strange for me because it seemed that Rhapsody was something that came more from a desire to prove myself also that I am still part of the big Western music canon as a composer,
Mhm.
especially to my supervisors, perhaps in France. And this idea that perhaps I had to use these elements that were very foreign to me uh, to justify of my work that is very much based on life stories and performance and something that is very intuitive um, and does not necessarily need or benefit from uh, comparing it or using these big European traditions to justify it. So what happened when I started moving away from Rhapsody in music, I discovered Rhapsody um, in ancient Greece and what its purpose was. So the rhapsode, uh, the etymology of the word is the song weaver. It's the person that weaves different songs together. And when I say songs, we're talking about epic poems. Um, we can think that, like for example, Homer, um, who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, is a rhapsode because he himself collected different narratives, different stories of different epic poems related to these two big canons and weaved them together before transmitting them. And a rhapsode is a troubadour. It's perhaps an early troubadour because it is exactly this. And it always comes from this idea that is the language that is used is really important. The troubadours in medieval France, so troubadour for the south, trouvère for the north, they would sing in roman, langue d'oil ou languedoc, which was the very early French, and it was the language of the people, right? Because the churches and the high institutions would speak Latin. So there's this idea also that these epic poems, these um, expressions of love, of stories of exile, are always sung in a language that is close to the heart of the people listening to them. And I feel like perhaps what happened in music is that we lost the rhapsode, or separated the rhapsode from the rhapsody. You know, like Rhapsody became something that you would collect these melodies from these people and villages and perform them to an audience in a space where these villagers will never be able to enter in their lifetime. So it seems really, and I think it resonated a lot with my own work because I was so caught up with wanting to weave French, Québécois, Lebanese culture when I'm working with oral history. But at the end of the day, my audience, when I look at it, when I look at them, none of the voices that are on stage are represented because the space itself is not welcoming and it was not meant for them. So I talk a lot about the rhapsodic like standpoint and this idea that perhaps if we are to dig even further, a rhapsode is a foreigner. It is someone who comes from outside and carries something really strong, a testimony that is unheard of. I mentioned that in Plato's Republic, we talk a lot about the rhapsodic competitions, and the only rhapsode that were allowed to sing Lamentations were the foreigners, because they were so afraid that if Lamentations were sung from within the city, people would start asking questions and would start also wondering about, oh, what about the civil war we just lived? Athens experienced a huge civil war in ancient times, and the response was exactly the same as the one in contemporary Lebanon, where we just decided to forget everything.
Yeah.
And when for example, the Euripide started like talking about the Trojan woman and uh, and putting the voices of the victims of the people on stage, there was an immediate backlash. And Nietzsche would say that Euripide killed the tragedy because he let the voice of the people come on stage. So all this correlation is already there. And when we think about it today, I think adopting this rhapsodic standpoint is saying that as someone who is in exile here on stolen territory, it is neither the standpoint of someone who is indigenous to a place and is on stolen territory that will help us, but rather understanding that right now, as a foreigner, the only thing that is beneficial in this standpoint is to be able to be this outside voice that is calling for lamentation, for grief. And in practice, I think that it also stems from this idea to not be afraid of tradition and use the traditions that are already there, because people have always used lamentation as a way to grieve. And even in a secular society, there's a way to implement it and make it still very visible.
Yeah, so for me, part of this is about connection, connecting to souls and people from other moments in history, but it also evokes this dynamic of time travel for me. Do you want to, does that resonate for you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Uh, well, another thing in Rhapsody is that I think the first people that really brought back the initial idea of how the original like force of the rhapsode were uh, theater makers and researchers in Paris, most notably Jean-Pierre Sarrazac, who wrote a wonderful book called L'avenir du drame, in which he advocates for rhapsodic theater. And he talks about the voice of the rhapsode. And this voice of the rhapsode is basically someone, a character on stage that takes a step back and is going against the tragic action happening on stage in order to give a testimony. And it seems that to be a rhapsode is to be a time traveler, because the only way to be able to witness or be a narrator is to be outside of time.
Mhm.
I don't think that any one of us in my own family even thought of the possibility of um, talking about our experiences. And my parents, uh, they have lived more years than me, and they have lived uh, more hardship and during wartime. And I don't think that the question of giving a testimony or understanding what happened before came to them.
Mhm.
And because being in Montreal, especially in the beginning, was also a space um, of just like understanding and unraveling what was happening,
Mhm.
it became this act of time traveling. And I think Lamentation always has to begin with time traveling. Time traveling in the way and the sense that, and on a very practical sense, there is no way to lament if the ancestors are not called upon.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's the first gesture in lamentation. And also, from a very historical standpoint, understanding where I am now, uh, Jojagi, Montreal, 2024, far from home, and a home that is constantly changing.
Mhm.
So there is no way to lament or to understand my own grief if I am to think about it right now.
Mhm.
And if I may add one last thing, and it's something that my supervisor Guy Coults talk about. And if I may share, just because it's a wonderful book, he
Mhm.
wrote this book called Performing Mourning,
Mhm.
um, and he he talks about Susan Sontag, who lost her father when she was 6, I believe,
Mhm.
and her father was working in China. And when she was older, she wanted to go back to China to be on the traces of her late father.
Mhm.
And he asks himself, is it her that wants to go back to China? Or is it her when she was 6? And I think that we forget that a grief that began when we were children has to be treated as if we were still kids, even though we're treating it today.
Okay.
I don't, when I am grieving the the 2006 war and what it did to my family, the person that is grieving is not me, but it is the child version of me at that time.
Mhm.
And thus, time traveling is also an embodied experience. It's something that requires us to become the child that experienced this violence and treat the child's grief as if we were this child today.
Mhm. So I know you have a little film clip and it has a picture of you and your sister with your parents in a boat. And was that in North Lebanon? Your parents took you away from the fighting? And it just struck me that you look quite peaceful in that clip. And I also really, your mom was singing to you and you were singing with her, and I was, wondering what song it was, but we can get back to that in a minute. Um, yeah, so it's interesting that these layers of time and grieving are kind of superimposed. Um, because I could also see, like, as an act of resistance, your parents trying to take you to safe places and distract you on the water and a beautiful day and the singing. So, yeah, it's multi-layered. Hey, did you learn a lot about the things that you later were grieving after?
Hmm. No, absolutely. I'm learning about them today, and it took such a long time to begin understanding. Um, some of the things were completely fabricated, and without like getting too much into detail, but
Yeah.
I've always like grown up thinking that certain certain people who were, for example, disabled because of the war were actually disabled because of like I got like a car accident, like oh like a car like drove over their foot, you know. So my mom would like, use all these images that were very simple in order to not have me think about like what it doesn't mean to be disabled because of a sniper that you know.
Mhm.
Uh, and these images are very present, and I see that they're also present in the way that I think about yeah, just like my own instincts when I see someone uh, who experienced war. I recognize things in them, but not for the same reasons as, for example, someone else who understands why they are like this or why they experience certain things like this. Um, yeah, and I think during that time, part of also not wanting to know, I think, was maybe perhaps at least from an um, uh, like unconscious perspective. I think I knew to some level what was happening,
Yeah.
but my mechanism of defense was creating this fantasy world. Uh, I was always surrounded by Broadway musicals, and it was also the way that I dealt with a lot of the things by singing about it.
Yeah.
And I think like my in my own work currently, I would love to be able to do more like music theater when it comes to oral history. But I always thought that was something that was more like a sweet, perhaps like a funny element to the work.
Mhm.
But I want to see, if I may digress a bit, I want to see a drag queen called Sasha Colby. Uh, and they did this number where they performed "She Used to Be Mine" by the musical and the musical Waitress,
Okay.
um, and it was such an unraveling of emotions, um, and when I was watching this, it felt like a lamentation itself.
Mhm.
And right after followed um, what I believe was an indigenous Hawaiian dance.
Mm.
And this idea of being in that space and seeing someone who is almost, without knowing, giving me permission to also think of why musicals were present at that time,
Right.
and why or how did they perhaps, like, without me knowing, give me that space
Mhm.
to understand, even though I didn't have all the elements.
Yeah. Well, that's really beautiful. I always thought that musicals were really goofy, but you put in another dimension on there for me to appreciate. Not that I never engaged in them. Singing and dancing is really fun, but yeah, that's really something. And so just I want to get back to this idea a little bit about the outsider being inserted into different moments in time, and also that's a sci-fi theme as well. But I do you see yourself in some way as being kind of inserted into like Quebec society, where people either really misunderstand or they don't really care, they're occupied with their own stuff here, or if you went back to Lebanon, in some way you might feel like kind of an outsider there. How do you relate to this idea yourself?
Hmm.
Somebody who's bringing the lamentation.
Well, I think like I had the biggest wake-up call last year when I was auditioning for a doctoral contract in Paris, because I still had this idea that I would love to be able to be a PhD student there and continue my work.
Yeah.
Um, and it was at that time where there was the death of a young boy of Algerian descent, I believe, Nael, who was 17, who was shot by the police. And without, I would not permit myself to do correlations between the two, but they were happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And as I was talking about my work and mentioning autoethnography and mentioning, uh, this idea in indigenous methodologies that oral history is a primary source,
Yeah.
I was getting all these really intense reactions, um, and the first reaction to my proposal was, okay, but I mean, who are you? Are you trained to be a musician? And I guess there was this idea of, um, I think I grew up a lot with illusions of being accepted in certain spaces.
Yeah.
But the truth is, the rug can be swept under me at any point. Um, and I still am very much attached to certain elements of France. Part of my family is there. I am also the product of French education,
Mhm.
because this is also Lebanon's specificity, is that a lot of us experience uh, colonialism in a very uh, bittersweet, sometimes even enthusiastic way, because we don't realize that culturally wise, we have been impoverished. Um, and I think even in Quebec, we I might perhaps say something similar. I think that I still feel that there is more space here to not be an outsider,
Mhm.
uh, just because we are in a space where, just like in Lebanon, there's this binary of people that are living both the perpetrator and the victim experience.
Mhm.
And just like in Lebanon, we are unable to talk about certain events that occurred here,
Yeah.
even though they were recent. Uh, and it took it took little bodies to come out of the ground for people to discuss and to understand.
Mm.
And uh, there's something here where the outsider perspective, I think, helps, um, because I think we are all outsiders at this point, except for the indigenous peoples of this land. And to think otherwise is not helping anyone understand what our position would be.
Mhm.
When we are lamenting here as people who are the product of exile, who are we lamenting for? Is it a way to be connected to our country,
Mhm.
or is it also a way to ground ourselves here? And I think the outsider standpoint, the rhapsodic standpoint, could be an interesting way, because acting like this territory uh, is kind and receiving us is not true,
Mhm.
and acting like our own uh, homeland is also awaiting our return is perhaps not true also. Um, but I think what is the most true is the grief that we have of exile and the grief of being far.
Mhm.
And I think that perhaps in Quebec, more people uh, can also relate to this experience.
Mhm.
And perhaps lamentation is also a way to get the conversation rolling.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought there. And as a Métis person, I I wouldn't say that I feel like an outsider, but I do feel like I live in the borderlands, in the in-between spaces, and I think you probably do too, in some ways. Yeah, so if it's okay, can I go back to your song?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so do you remember the lyrics of the song that your mom was singing with you? And I just want to say it's a real testament to mothers and to your mother. I've been, investigating this topic of mothering under siege and surveillance, and so mothering when you're being exposed to violence certainly is, quite an international phenomenon. And to see you talk about how your mother made up like random injuries so that she wouldn't have to tell you that people were getting hurt
Mm,
in in a war with war wounds, but sort of sometimes slightly entertaining ways people were getting hurt. It just shows so much love and creativity, right?
mm.
Yeah. So can you tell me how the song went?
It's Yatapta Mandala. And it's this, so Nancy Ajram, the singer, is like, um I think there's so much to say about why this song, and but Nancy Ajram is basically she's our Celine, she's our Britney Spears. And she is really much adored by queer Lebanese. So the song is extremely campy, and I think it's just so funny that this is the song that was playing on the boat at this moment, right before the Israeli invasion. And yeah, I look very happy. I think it was a song that I really enjoyed. Um, and yeah, and I think the song itself is a testimony.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's also a way to understand uh, not only I guess what was, because it is almost like contextualizing also. It's we're in 2006. We're at the peak of Lebanese diva singers, uh, and it also intervenes at a point where Lebanon had a couple of years of break. And in the year 2000, the South was freed. Um, there was an attempt to create a committee of reconciliation to find the bodies of the disappeared. So I think between 2000 and 2006, there was obviously a lot of events, the assassination of the prime minister that we can talk about. But what was mostly happening was kind of like a liminal space where we were happy, I think.
Mm.
And my parents had this idea that the war is over and they were going to be able to raise their kids uh, in their city, and we would get to be, and we did get to travel around Lebanon and see it.
Mhm.
And this video happens so in the archive itself, because my mom kept a very neat archive of everything. It goes this video, and right after a series of photos of destroyed buildings and houses.
Mhm.
And I believe it's 6 days before the invasion. So it's a testimony in itself, but it's also something that is extremely liminal, like seeing my family together on a boat in the south, and knowing that the next move was uh, having to pack up our things because the army was entering our neighborhood gradually and going to the north. Um, and yeah, and I think it's when thinking about lamentation, I think and time traveling, there's something in this video, in this memory, that is important to unravel because it is the beginning of something shortly after my parents applied for immigration. And I don't think it's something that they thought of before, but they felt like, I think they something there happened and they realized that we were unable to leave the country because we didn't have another citizenship. And nothing was the same after that, of course. We were just immigrants in the making.
Wow. Well, I'm really touched that you agreed to share that. I mean, that's so beautiful. And I had no idea that there were so many, layers of meaning in that song. So we've covered a bit of ground around your work, and I'm sure that this is also just scratching the surface of your process and how you've been making meaning all along and integrating, music into Lamentation and bringing in, the ancient Greeks and really the history of rhapsode and rhapsody. But I'm really delighted that you agreed to talk with me today. It's been really, really quite wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much, Kathy, for having me.
Yeah, and I just want to give you the last word. Is there something that you'd like to share to kind of tie it together today or wrap it up?
No, I'm just very grateful for this space to talk about them, and I'm very grateful also to be surrounded by people who are grieving and are outspoken about their grief, and yeah, hopefully this might be something that can take more space in academia, and it's something that I'm very hopeful for. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, and maybe the spirit and energy of this video can be a testament to a longing for peace. Yeah. Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and hope you have a beautiful day and that Jad has given you some wonderful thoughts that you can carry through the weekend with and just reflect upon. So all our relations.